But that first issue of Spider-Man just grabbed me, like, and because Ditko's Spider-Man, just looked so different and felt so different from the Spider-Mans that I had been reading, for, well, at that point, my entire life. And it's not as though like my 10-year-old brain like really understood like the nuances or like, how to appreciate art. I just knew that there was something weird and different about this. And because of that, like I was just immediately attracted to it. So I ended up seeking out as much of his stuff, whenever I could. So I was like, oh, I have Speedball comics. Oh, this is the same guy. Like I've got this, that, and this. And so from that point, like, and as I got older and I learned more about it, and learned, actually learned how to collect, Ditko was somebody I immediately gravitated towards. He was the first artist that I really knew their name and, wanted and actively sought out their work. And then I picked up other people along the way, of course, but he was the first guy.
The working title when I was writing it was called Dealing with Ditko. That sounds negative. And although a lot of people had difficulty working with him, that never happened with me. I never had any difficulty. One of the things I emphasize in the book is that whatever idea I came to him with, he would accentuate it. He would add to it creatively. He said, well, what about this? Could we do that? Could we add that? And I talked about that in the book. And when the book came out, Mark Ditko wrote a review. One of the things he liked about the book was the fact that I emphasized the fact that Steve was not just an artist, he was a collaborator.
He passed away, and I went back to Johnstown because I live in Los Angeles. My dad and my younger brother, met. And one of the first things that my dad said is, we should do a book called Steve Ditko, the Man. People didn't know who he was, and we knew that. One of our missions is to actually say who he was as a person. And my dad expanded as a family member, as a brother, as a son, as an uncle, as a friend.
And people call him an enigma because he wasn't an enigma to me. He was one of my friends and we worked together. So to see that perceptive from outside the industry, people looking in, it was always kind of funny to me.
The things I've always been interested in with him is the myth versus the man. Getting with the myth that he had retired. No, he didn't. He worked every day, literally until he died.
Steve Ditko's impact on the comic book medium cannot be overstated. His work helped to define the modern superhero genre, with globally recognized characters such as Doctor Strange and Spider-Man. Over half a century since their creation, it was Steve Ditko's foundational designs and storytelling which helped to launch, arguably, the most impactful stories within the medium, which to this day still inspire other creators in the field, as well as Hollywood blockbuster adaptations, animated series, games, and more. Born in Johnstown, Pennsylvania in 1927, much has been said and read about the work of Steve Ditko. But as far as for the man himself, he was a private individual who was not present at comic conventions or cameoed in any movie adaptations of his work. Preferring for his work to speak for itself, commentary around the genesis of his stories and characters often went uncontested. In the absence of any further comment or elaboration from Mr. Ditko, certain myths around the man himself also emerged. Key among these myths was that he was a reclusive individual who cut himself off from the world to work in his studio and was a singular follower of the philosophical system of objectivism, keeping conservative political views. But, as this documentary will explore, there is far more to the story of Steve Ditko than what is commonly believed. In 2025, Eoin McAuley, president of Tala Academy of Sequential Art, conducted 3 separate interviews with those who knew Steve Ditko from his professional and personal life. Nephew and godson, Mark Zen Ditko, fellow creative collaborator and friend Jack C. Harris, an academic and student of Ditko's body of work, Dr. Zack Kruse. Together, these interviews present a new tapestry of the Steve Ditko story as we begin our journey with Mark Ditko and explore Steve's early life from his hometown of Johnstown, Pennsylvania.
I have, there's 5 of us. So I have an older brother, a younger brother, and 2 younger sisters. But there's really, my uncle had one brother, my dad, and then 2 sisters. So the 2 sisters obviously got married. So there's 2 cousins on my Aunt Annie's side, and then there's, I think, 5 siblings on my other aunt. So I think there's 11 of us or 12 of us that are the nieces and nephews. When I was growing up, we didn't know what he did as little kids. In fact, my dad always has told this story of him overhearing my uncle talking to his mom, my grandmother on his side, and him saying, coming back from New York one Christmas or for a barbecue or whatever, and him saying, look, I don't want to talk about business. I don't want to talk about what's going on in New York. I don't want to talk about what I'm doing. I'm here for a vacation. I'm not here for business. I'm here for vacation. I don't want to get immersed in that. That's why I'm here. I want to talk. I want to be with my family, and I want to do family things, and I want to be immersed in the family. So I don't really want to talk about that. And that got transmitted down to all of his brothers and sisters and the older relatives. So it was never really talked about. Now, that doesn't mean there weren't comics all around the house, because he would send us things. So I grew up, and my first kind of memory is, being 4 years old or 5 years old, 1963, 1964, and reading, Spider-Man was around. But I gravitated towards Conga. So Conga was something, this Charlton stuff, I just loved it. And it actually probably planted the seeds of my fascination for gorillas, or my love of gorillas, But, again, it's interesting, and this is something that we're talking about in our friends. We have a book called Friends and Family that we're trying to, compile and structure and get out there about how to present this information that we have. But there was one time he was showing my older brother how to draw something. We're 4, 5, 6 years old. So I'm thinking, oh my gosh, Uncle Steve could draw. So I go up to him and I say, Uncle Steve, do you think you could draw a gorilla? Because I like gorillas. And little did I know, he's obviously drawing Conga that I'm reading. So he whips out this gorilla. And I was like, wow, Uncle Steve, you're good. But that was the nature of our childhood. And then really when we found out, we were probably in our early teens somewhere. At that point, it was like a non-event. It was like, oh, Uncle Steve did that. Wow. It's like realizing that one of your aunts or uncles or something had, created, Tupperware or something new, oh, they were the ones that actually created the tissue box or something. It's like, wow, that's impressive. But it wasn't something that was, like surreal, mind-altering, that it was just something like, wow, because he was still fundamentally our uncle, and that's how we kind of knew him for, our whole childhood. So, and I would say that's probably true for all of my siblings. When they found out, it was like, wow, that's cool.
I never met anyone, professional or otherwise, who wanted to be a comic book artist more than Steve Ditko did.
After he graduated high school, which he obviously was taking drafting, he had obviously drawing classes, but just the standard high school level, classes, chemistry and the sciences and the maths and things. But then from what I recall, after he graduated, he enlisted in the army, and he went to Germany, post-war Germany, and he was over there for a few years. And then when he came back, he went back to Johnstown, and he enrolled in a commercial art school. So he was taking commercial art. And then after a few years of that, then he moved to New York and enrolled in the art school with Jerry Robinson, and and he moved out there, and he had, at that point, he moved there with one mission. He's getting into comics at that point. He's he's committed.
That's what he wanted to do. He wanted to be a comic book artist, and that's what he was doing, and he was really happy with it. And he was never not doing it. I mean, even when he didn't have an assignment, he was creating something. And there must have been, I think I mentioned in the book, there was dozens of characters tacked on his wall of his studio that no one ever saw. You know, that he would make them up, and I think he'd make up a couple a day. You know, that's what he was doing. It was astonishing.
We have, again, I don't know what time period these would be in, but we have index cards where he was drawing characters. He would have a headshot on one side, on the other side, a full body shot. And there's stacks of index cards that he was Golden Age characters, some of them maybe that he made up. I don't know, that we have, but so he was drawing. Look, his dad was passionate about comics. His dad would take vacations, and he would sit in his chair by the fireplace and just read comics all day.
Wow.
That was his vacations. So he grew up in an environment where his dad was passionate about Prince Valiant and all these comics, and that's what he grew up in. My uncle was known as Batman, in the neighborhood, and his friend was Robin. As far as his, engineering, scientific bent, my dad has said over and over again, when they were kids growing up, he had his own, secret cabin in the barn that he had built in the corner of the barn, hidden, that he had a hidden key and a hidden way to get into this, which my dad found out and eventually got in there. And he had collections of skulls and feathers and his microscopes and his chemistry sets, and he had taken fingerprints of everybody in the family, and he was a scientist in a way. He loved that aspect of things, even as a kid. So it would make sense to me that he would integrate that into what he was doing, in comics. He's kind of immersed in that. So at what point did he say, I'm gonna go into comics? I don't know, but obviously it was, I would think it was somewhere in that commercial art phase after he had come back from the military and realizing on the GI Bill he could go to school in New York and actually pursue that. And then he packed it up and moved to New York.
Well, basically, our conversations were about three things: books on philosophy, crime philosophy, movies and comics. And his studio, again, days before the internet, there were shelves and shelves of movie stills, movie photos from movies, and he used as reference. And he loved movies. He went to the movies all the time. We would talk movies a lot. We'd talk about what our favorite movies were and things like that. He loved movies. He really, really enjoyed it. I think movies and comics were his passion. So he loved film. His family once a year at Christmas time, he would tell me, I'm not going to be available for next week. I'm going to be in Pennsylvania visiting my family. And that was it. And I don't think he ever went anywhere else. And it was very funny. He had a very small studio. I never saw the last studio. I used to visit him in the studio he had before the last studio he had. He wouldn't let anybody in the new studio. He didn't like people in his studio. So in the last conversation I had with him, we were out in the hallway in front of his office. We didn't want anybody in there. But in the old studio, I'd come up and we'd sit, and it was like really small, very small area. Had one window. He had a huge drawing board, and all these books, and surrounded by books and movie stills, and a little black and white rabbit ear television sitting in the corner that he would turn on and watch. And that was it, and out the window I always thought it was funny, if you look out the window, you can see one of those water towers that's in every issue of Spider-Man. It's right outside the window. And so I think he drew that in every Spider-Man story ever drew, that water tower. It was, in fact, in New York, when we were walking with other people, we would refer to those as Steve Ditko water towers. I mean, I was a DC fan. And Ditko, the stuff Ditko was, that's what drew me to Marvel. I mean,
Yeah.
all the Spider-Man annual, the Spider-Mans, all that stuff. That's what made me start reading the Marvel comics. It was all Steve. That's what I kept looking for. I kept looking for Steve Ditko stuff that was in the books. So I remember one of the most amazing things, and they were very clever in the first Spider-Man annual, because Marvel had original stories in the annuals, unlike DC.
Yeah.
Because they didn't have that much to reprint, so they had to write new stuff. In that first Spider-Man annual, Spider-Man runs across every single character in the Marvel universe. He just passes them by, just has a moment with them. Thor flies by, Doctor Strange walks by, he sees Giant Man in the background and all. So Steve drew the entire Marvel line in that one book. And of course, I hadn't started reading Marvel, but then when I read all that stuff and saw Spider-Man interacting with all these other characters, I got to find out who all these characters are. So that brought me over.
Following Amazing Spider-Man number 38, Steve Ditko walked away from both The Amazing Spider-Man and Marvel itself. This was not, however, the end of Steve Ditko's career in comics, as he would go on to work for Charlton Comics and DC Comics, creating noted characters such as the Question and the Creeper, as well as his own creator-owned characters such as Mr. A and Static, among many, many more. Ditko did in fact return to Marvel in the 1990s, but he never returned to any previous Marvel characters associated with him. But he did create new characters for Marvel, such as Squirrel Girl with Will Murray. We'll explore his reasons for departure, but what was notable was his refusal to speak on anything related to Marvel when approached by other creators on the matter.
He and I started writing back and forth in the late 80s. I've known him all my life. He's my godfather. I was born and he was there. So, but he and I wrote a lot back and forth, starting in the late 80s. He was I'll say a private person. He kept his work separate from his family.
Never ever. I only had one conversation with Steve about Marvel. We had actually two conversations. I initiated one and he initiated the other, just an off comment somewhere. And I knew he didn't like to talk about it, but he was aware of how people viewed him, and he was fine with it. So they want to think that I'm a reclusive and a hermit. Fine, let them think that they'll leave me alone, and then I could work. So that's basically what he felt. But he wasn't like that. But he didn't mind the perception of that. He just said, "Okay, that's good. No one will bother me if they think that I'm that way."
Joke I often make about him and about sort of the recluse comment is that, number one, like his office is in Times Square. Like not only is like his address in the book, but he's in Times Square. He's not hiding, guys. And number two, like just because someone doesn't want to talk to you personally doesn't make them a recluse, right? Just because someone values their personal space doesn't make them a recluse in that sort of pejorative sense. It just means that maybe they just value their space, right? Or maybe as you point out, and I think you're 100% correct, maybe they don't want to get involved in some circus. Maybe they've seen what goes on in comics fandom and they are over it, right? Like that is not a recluse. That sounds like sanity, like distilled. Yeah, but my dealings with him, limited as they were always positive and kind, and he was generous with his time, even responding at all.
In our writing, I wrote to him with things that were on my mind. Yes, I went to comic conventions. I met, Jack Kirby and Stan Lee and Jim Shooter, all these people, and I would write to him about that. But now I'm getting much more involved. I wish I could write to him because I would ask him a plethora of additional questions, and even more on a philosophical note. Something I probably would say is, Uncle Steve, you kept your life so private and released, very little about yourself. Do you understand that created a vacuum of information surrounding you, which then, nature abhors a vacuum, all kinds of things started to just speculation, innuendos, all this stuff came in to fill that vacuum. That the thing that you despised the most, people, saying things that they were not qualified to say. You generated an environment that created that, because you created this vacuum. Had you been, a little bit more. Now, I say that just sort of offhandedly, because I know that he would say, I don't care, because he didn't really care. So, but he did generate this vacuum of information, which then got filled by all of this, I'll say untruths, half-truths, or whatever. And again, what we're trying to do is just fill that vacuum with truth from a family perspective, in the way that we understood him and the way we interacted with him in our stories.
One of the funniest letters I ever saw from him, a fan had it. He wrote and asked him for his autograph. And Steve wrote back, sorry, I don't give autographs until he signs the letter.
Amazing.
And of course, he was laughing when he did that. He wouldn't sign his work. He wouldn't sign you a book or something like that. But you wrote him a letter, he would write back. He liked to write letters, and I had a lot of letters from him. Unfortunately, I didn't save a lot of those. But in fact, when I contacted him, I usually contacted him by writing him a note, and he would do one of two things: he'd either call me up or he'd send me a note. And that's why I knew he wasn't around anymore, because he didn't respond to that last letter I wrote. But he always wrote, and he always signed his name, so it was nice. And he was very friendly to people who approached him. If you wrote him a letter, he would write back to you. If you called him on the phone, he would talk to you. I remember one artist, I won't mention his name, but he actually left the office the same time Steve did, and attempted to engage him in conversation about Marvel. And Steve just smiled and said goodbye.
Although Steve Ditko never returned to work on any of his Marvel characters, in 2024 at the D23 Expo, he was honored as a Disney legend for his contributions to Marvel, and good relations are held between the Ditko family and Marvel to this day.
Our relationship with Marvel is, I couldn't ask for anything more. Right now, I could easily have dialogue, with Marvel. We're not necessarily collaborating on anything right now. Well, there's a few things that are going on, but nothing that really can be talked about right now. But there's absolutely a relationship there. In fact, I had lunch and dinner with 3 Marvel people just over the past month.
Oh, there you go.
So yeah, we absolutely, they are very attentive, to us and our needs. So, right now it's only just been, when they come in town, we connect up, we have dinner, we talk. Or if we happen to, I was at the Kirby exhibit that opened here a month or so ago, and met someone at Marvel, and we had lunch, a few weeks later, and he was in charge of all the worldwide Marvel installations in Disney. So he's that Disney connection for all things Marvel. When he won the Disney Legends Award, Kevin Feige called me a couple of weeks prior to that, and he said, Mark, I know that your uncle didn't like awards and wasn't, this is not something that he would really strive for or think. He said, somebody needs to say that. Somebody needs to make it clear that this is not something that he would have embraced. But so Kevin called me specifically to make sure that was said.
Oh, fantastic.
And to me, that just shows where Kevin's head is at and what he understands. And all of my conversations with anybody at Marvel, it's clear they understand very clearly who Steve Ditko was and what his role was and is.
Steve Ditko is noted as only ever attending one comic book convention, the 1964 New York Comic-Con, at the Workman's Circle building in Manhattan. The New York Comic-Con was the world's first recorded official comic book convention. The one-day event drew around 100 attendees. His absence from the convention scene is likely a contributing factor to some of the many myths which surround Ditko. But his nephew Mark, a comic book fan himself, was able to attend shows and connect with some of Steve's former colleagues.
Oh, I did what my uncle despised. I used my name.
Oh.
All I had to do was say who I was. Mm-hmm. And then, they were very welcoming. I left Johnstown in 1984, and basically started my life. I moved to Phoenix, Arizona. I got married, had my first child, and, I was living my own life. And then the late 80s, he and I reconnected with some letters. And then I moved to Los Angeles in 91. I think around 91. And then that's when comics started to, I saw, we were grocery shopping, and I looked across the street, and there was a yard sale, and I saw a bunch of comic boxes. And I thought, wow, comics. I should probably go over there. So I went over there, and I'm just looking through the comics, and the guy selling it comes over, says, "Hey, anything in particular you're looking for?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm looking for Ditko stuff." And of course we get to talking, and I say, "Yeah, Mark Ditko, his nephew." And he was like, "Whoa, okay." That was sort of mind blown, to him. And he said, "Come here, let me show you something." And he takes me into the apartment complex, into the basement, and he has 2 large trunks full of comics. And he says, I guess he used to, maybe was associated with a comic shop or something like that, or maybe it was just his collection. He said, "I know I have Ditko in there." And he said, "I'll give you both, because of who you are, I'll give you both of those trunks for $200.
Oh, wow.
And I said, "I'll take them." So that kind of launched me into really getting back into comics. Then I'm in Los Angeles. So yeah, I went to San Diego Comic-Con, through the early 90s. And yeah, I walked in to see Jim Shooter and, Jack Kirby and Stan Lee and all these people, because I said, "Yeah, I'm Mark Ditko, Steve Ditko's nephew." And it's like, wow, I mean, the DNA is in the house. He knew who I was, because I said that. And then Jack and I, we had one conversation I remember, is he said, "Hey, Steve Ditko did Steve ever get a girlfriend?" Or made some offhand comment in. And then when I would write my uncle, I would relay these messages, and I would, tell him my experiences and what I'm doing and who I'm talking to.
And how did he receive that news? Did he just go okay and just move on? Like, is that it? It didn't faze him?
No.
Chief among his reasons for declining interviews and refusing to participate at comic conventions was Steve Ditko's belief that his work should speak for itself. Unlike other contemporary comic book creators of the time, Steve went to great lengths to plan ahead in his storytelling and create interconnecting points. As a visual medium, a lot of how Ditko planted the seeds for future stories was achieved graphically on the page. This will serve as an important point when exploring the reasons why he ultimately left the Amazing Spider-Man title and Marvel as a whole. But before explaining that branch of the Ditko story, let's first address his creation of the character of Doctor Strange. Although Steve Ditko rarely provided interviews, he was a frequent correspondent who was easy to contact and preferred to communicate via written letter. He did, however, also produce several essays, some of which pertain to his work. Doctor Strange appeared in Strange Tales number 110, and Dr. Zack Kruse, in his reading of Ditko's essays, in addition to his own written correspondence with him, has helped to draw attention to the fact that Ditko's intention was to depict Doctor Strange as an Asian character. It was then, in Strange Tales number 115, that Doctor Strange's origin story was first told. It was at this juncture that Stan Lee introduced the elements of Dr. Stephen Strange as the arrogant surgeon who, after a car crash, journeys to the Far East in search of a cure for his injured hands. This juncture begins to steer Strange into a more anglicized direction.
You could tell, like, right, it's like, okay, like, I've given you an answer to this. I'm moving on because I'm not press on with this.
Yeah.
Like, I've already done this. Time's ticking. Like, I'm not going to keep doing it. So a good example of that is when I asked him about Doctor Strange and whether or not Doctor Strange is Asian.
Yes.
And he writes back and he says, yeah, the answer's in the first issue. Have you not read Strange Tales 110? Right? Like, you know, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but that was basically the tone. Like, you know the answer to this. I'm not going to, you know, pursue this kind of reasoning. If you want to talk about ideas, okay, fine. But like, this is a journalistic question about a comic I wrote, you know, at that point, 50 years, you know, prior, right? Like, I'm not going over this again. I already told you it's in the art, right? So things like that, like, he doesn't suffer fools, right?
Possibly among the more popular myths associated with Steve Ditko was that he was an ardent objectivist. Dr. Zack Kruse, with his book Mysterious Travelers, Steve Ditko and the Search for a New Liberal Identity, and working with the Ditko family in cataloging Steve's personal library,
His library.
Oh, incredible.
has revealed that there is far more complexity to Steve Ditko's personal philosophy than generally perceived by the public.
I was bamboozled, you know, into buying that objectivist myth too, because it's so surface level, right? And you know, and he certainly gave people, you know, frankly, through his work, gave people to reason to sort of run with that, right? So you know, I was a long time sort of acceptor of that myth until I started doing more of the reading, you know, in the comics, fine, but more reading of his essays and more reading of the sort of short missives that he was writing. And the one that stuck out to me that sort of led to me to really sort of, like, I was suspicious of the objectivist stuff anyway, because of the way that, you know, not just Spider-Man, but like stories like Hawk and Dove, right? Like, that doesn't jive. There's things that don't jive there. Doctor Strange, there are things that don't jive there. A lot of his horror stuff, there's things that just don't jive there. So, you know, there was question marks, but then he writes this short piece in one of Robin Snyder's publications where he, you know, he's taking on some of those myths. He says, people say I'm conservative. Who says that? When did I say this? And then he says the exact same thing about objectivism. Who said I'm an objectivist? Where did you get that information? And I thought, oh shit, you're right. I should look, right? Because I was just making the connections, like, because I had suffered through enough Ayn Rand, right? To know, like, okay, these are the references, right? Like, I can make this, if I had to make this case, I can make this case, right? But then he writes that, and I think it's like maybe, I think it was maybe 2015 or 2016 when he writes that. It's very late.
Yeah.
And so I start going back. I'm like, well, where is it? There's only one instance where he says I'm an objectivist. And there's the very famous Masters of Comic Book Art documentary where he says Mr. A is an objectivist. He doesn't say I, Steve Ditko, am. He says Mr. A is, right? And that raises questions about, you know, my work is me and so on and so forth. But he also creates a critical distinction there between himself and his characters, right? He's not, you know, exactly. There's not one-to-one. So then I go back, and there's only one instance of him ever saying that, ever. And it's in the early 1960s in a fanzine, right? For the Violence the Phony issue, the very famous, you know, thing where he is railing against people who are upset about pretend fantasy violence, right? It's mostly about the comics code, but it's about anybody complaining about that stuff. He thinks they're ridiculous, and they probably are. But that's the only time he says it. And then every reprint of that exact same image, he's changed it. He edits out that word, right? And very conspicuously takes that word out. So there's nowhere in print in his comics where he identifies himself as having that very particular and peculiar ideology. He's much more complicated than that. That doesn't mean he doesn't like it. He certainly likes it. He gave money to the Atlas Society. You know, he read lots of Nathaniel Branden. He had the Nathaniel Branden books on tape. He's got plenty of stuff from Ayn Rand, right? But the very fact that he's giving money to the Atlas Society and not the Ayn Rand Institute also tells you something about his objectivism, that it's much more, it's not a closed circuit for him. It's much more open-ended. So, you know, so he can't be pigeonholed into that one particular ideology. It doesn't mean he doesn't like it. He certainly does, and we shouldn't give him a pass for that. But like, that's just not the beginning or the end.
Yeah.
Right. And one of the ways I talk about this too with other folks is like, well, like, I believe in the golden rule, right? Like, I'm convinced that the golden rule is a good rule. I'm not a practicing Christian, right? But I think that rule is very good, right?
Yeah.
Like, and you can take any number of other things, any other sort of political parties or whatever. Like, well, I typically vote for this particular party, but I would never, ever in a million years identify myself as a member of that party, right?
Yeah.
Like, they just happen to be ideologically expedient, right? So, like, it's much more in line with how most of us behave and how most of us are sort of Velcro beings that sort of just attach these ideas as we are sort of, trying to move forward, right? I feel very confident that he believes in, ideological primacy, that his view of the world is shaped by him. And is he borrowing from other people? Yes, but he is reserving the right for himself to pick and choose which of those things he likes. You know that he's reading other stuff. I mean, I have in my possession his copy of the Communist Manifesto. He's reading Sartre. He's reading books on Buddhism. He's reading James Randi's, debunking books, right? Like, so he's really sort of, branching out and trying to figure out what pieces work for him. And and if we call him one thing, right, like, it's not objectivist. He's just not. Does he like it? Sure.
With your earlier interview, especially with Zack, is he had, which to me was probably one of the most admirable qualities that connected me to him, was someone with the level of integrity that he had, and so much certainty of self that was just, to me, it was just admirable. It was somebody who I looked up to. He actually became a bit of a guru to me in that way, because he had such a strong foundation and philosophy of life that when we would write, that's where our conversations went. He would say, Mark, you need to have a strong philosophy of life so that it will help you make the decisions that you need to make when those things arise in your life. So again, he was like an advisor to me, a life coach, a guru, and he would send me books. Have you ever read De Bono? And he did send me, The Fountainhead. You should read this, and you should read that. And I'd read that stuff so that in our conversations after that, it would make sense. But he knew I was into comics, and I think I had heard later that someone said, oh yeah, I was writing back to him and he told me that he had a nephew that was really into comics, and that would be me. So we conversed what he was interested in and what he wasn't interested in. He just kind of
is about identifying nuance and identifying that things are not cut and dry, and that there's always complexity here, and that those layers of complexity are sort of, it's like an onion, right? Like, there's just layers and layers and layers to them, and we might get so far and I might get so far, but there's going to come a time when I'm going to be working with the Ditkos and we're going to come across a document and a new layer will be revealed, right? Like something that I couldn't have accounted for and didn't know, right? And the same thing with yours. And that's the process, right? Is to not take anything for granted. You have to look, you have to scrutinize, you have to think complexly, right? So anyway, I just wanted to reinforce that because I just think it's such an important thing to get across, and like how these things come together. It's not just people making stuff up. Like, no. We really have to dig. We really have to think, right? Yeah. So anyway, I get worked up about this
Socrates,
stuff.
Plato, Aristotle, the criminal mind, on and on and on. Zack has been coming out to catalog his library, and I actually have very high-res pictures of his library that we've put in Johnstown in a place there where we're displaying some of his stuff, and I'm trying to get those around. And Zack will eventually, he's been cataloging this and all of his writings and little notations in there. So eventually his library, to show how extensive of things that he read, it's phenomenal. I mean, I say he was an intellectual.
The comic book characters created by Steve Ditko are recognizable around the world. But Steve himself was also a lifelong fan of the medium and its characters. In particular, Ditko was a big Batman fan. In 1984, he produced a pinup of Superman for the anniversary issue of Superman number 400 that also featured contributions from a host of leading artists from the time. But his only published Batman work was Man-Bat number 1, in which Steve penciled a story written by Jerry Conway and inked by Alan Milgrom. Batman made a guest appearance in this issue, marking the only time that Steve had officially drawn Batman. Jack Harris proposed Steve Ditko as a fill-in artist for the world's finest title for a Superman-Batman lead story. But editorial at the time were hesitant, as Jack Kirby, who had moved to DC and created the Fourth World series of comics, had included Superman in the title. DC editorial felt that his interpretation of Superman didn't match the then house style for the character and had many of his renderings of Superman repenciled and re-inked. Although DC never asked for samples of how his interpretation of Superman would look, they did ask for Ditko Batman samples, even after his story from Man-Bat number 1. Steve produced 7 pages of sketches of his depiction of Batman. He reinterpreted Batman's gauntlets as being actually razor sharp and not just cloth, serving as an effective weapon. But in his depiction on how these gauntlets could function, Batman's downward swipe sliced a criminal's tie in two, and a single drop of blood is seen dripping from his glove. This was then deemed by DC editorial to be too violent of an interpretation to proceed.
I stood over his shoulder and watched him draw quite a number of times. It's usually stuff that I was working on with him. It's funny, he never drew on the drawing board. He always had a smaller board on his lap, leaning against the drawing board, and he'd draw on his lap. That's what he do. Yeah. Well, I always thought that was weird. The reason he did the Batman sketches for me, I wanted him to do a fill-in of the lead of Waterworld's Finest, do a Superman Batman team up.
Yep.
And for some reason, now he had never drawn Superman, but he had drawn Batman. But they still wanted to see what he'd do with Batman. They never asked, "Oh, let's see his Superman sketches." No, they said, "Give us Batman sketches."
Okay.
And but when I saw that picture, Steve was telling me about it, we actually talked about that drawing. And there's some phrase out of the TV show that he based it on. If you look at the drawing, there's one phrase in the opening of Superman that he actually illustrated, and that was it. I always thought that was great, the sketches that everybody did. I mean, everybody from Ditko to Will Eisner to Walt Simonson, and everybody did a Superman sketch for that book, which is terrific. It was amazing.
No discussion of the life and legacy of Steve Ditko would be complete without an examination of perhaps his most celebrated character, Spider-Man. Spider-Man's origins are far more convoluted than initially understood by the public at large, with the very possibility of the idea of a Spider-Man no-hyphen character first being presented by Jack Kirby to Stan Lee. Steve Ditko produced 16 essays from his personal archival notes on the creation of Spider-Man, which have been provided by the Ditko family and consulted in the creation of this documentary. Although no living witnesses remain from the time of Spider-Man's conception, the often mythologized origin story of Stan Lee admiring a fly, climbing a wall, and having the idea to create an insect-related hero warrants further investigation. Jack Kirby and Joe Simon, the creators behind Captain America, had previously developed an insect-like superhero, the Fly, for Archie Comics. Possibly born out of this earlier idea, Kirby approached Stan Lee with some mock-ups of a Spider-Man no-hyphen character. In a mini-history 13 titled Speculation, Ditko writes that Stan Lee never told him who came up with the idea of Spider-Man or the Spider-Man story that Kirby was penciling at the time when he told Ditko that he would be inking the story. He did tell Ditko that Spider-Man was a teenager who had a magic ring that transformed him into an adult hero. Ditko told Lee that the ideas sounded similar to the Fly character that Kirby and Simon had worked on in 1959 for Archie Comics. Stan then called Jack about the Fly. Ditko states in his writing that he did not know what was said in the call. Later, Stan told Ditko that they would be doing Spider-Man together, with Ditko now penciling the story breakdowns from Stan's synopsis and doing the inking. The cover designed by Ditko for Amazing Fantasy 15, which would ultimately serve as Spider-Man's debut, was rejected in favor of a cover penciled by Jack Kirby and inked by Steve Ditko. None of the original Kirby Spider-Man designs were retained, much to Ditko's later regret. But a later illustration by Ditko, attempting to recollect the design on paper, clearly demonstrates how different the two approaches were and how instrumental Steve's work was in shaping the character as he is recognized to this day.
You know, my uncle has said he has very, very few, if any, regrets in life. In fact, the only regret that he said he has is that he didn't make a copy of those Jack Kirby Spider-Man pages when he first saw them, when he gave them to Stan as his draft of Spider-Man. He says that would have made so much go away. You know, it's about what was Jack's, involvement there. So anyway, my uncle said he had that regret.
What Marvel did, if you look at the first year of Fantastic Four, the first 3 issues are separate stories. There's plot lines and threads that go from issue to issue, but they're separate entities. But then you get to number 4, where they introduce the Submariner.
Yeah.
And then in number 5, they introduce Dr. Doom. And then in number 6, it's Doom and Submariner teamed up against the Fantastic Four. So those 3 issues, that was the first great Marvel trilogy, was Fantastic Four, number 4, 5, and 6. And then they started doing it all the time. It was an ongoing story, it never ended. It was like this ongoing soap opera. They would defeat the villain in every issue, but whatever social soap opera type of thing was going on with their lives, that was continuing on. That would just stretch to, especially in Spider-Man. And Steve picked up on that, and he would do that. Because all those old Spider-Mans, every one of them, without a doubt, Steve plotted them. Stan Lee did some dialogue, but they're Steve Ditko stories, 100%. He might say, hey, let's put Dr. Doom in it, but that's all he told him. He didn't say Dr. Doom is going to do this. He just said, put Dr. Doom in the story, and he'd do it. But it was all him. He did the whole plotting.
Perhaps the most iconic moment from Steve Ditko's run from Spider-Man, aside from the origin story, came from the Amazing Spider-Man issue number 33, the final chapter in the Master Planner story. Peter Parker finds himself pinned and trapped by tons of iron, which he must escape from in order to get a life-saving serum to his dying Aunt May. Vowing not to fail Aunt May, as he believed he failed his Uncle Ben, Spider-Man draws upon every ounce of strength to free himself. Moving from a 7-panel page to a 4-panel page, and finally one single-page shot, this sequence has been homaged by many Spider-Man creators since and adapted across many different mediums, featuring the web slinger.
The thing that I talk to students about all the time is because they've never read Ditko, right? Like they're probably only marginally aware of him, to be honest. But every one of them, has some sort of association with his ideas. And the example I give them every time is like, I've got, trying to think of a polite way to say this, I've got mixed feelings about the Marvel Cinematic Universe, right? Like very, very mixed feelings. However, they resonated with an entire generation of people. And if we ask ourselves, what are the things that resonate the most with them? Well, guess what? It comes from the lifting sequence.
Yeah.
Right? Like that moment with Steve Rogers in the alleyway where he says, I can do this all day. That's not Kirby and Simon. Right? Like that's the lifting sequence. Right? that great moment in the more recent Spider-Man films, in the Vulture one, Homecoming, right? What are they trying to recreate? And I think failed to recreate, but what are they trying to recreate? The lifting sequence, right?
How can you pages of 9 panels of basically the same picture?
Yeah.
You know, he did. You know, but you should see the struggle building, and then he does a full page of him actually escaping.
What makes Peter Parker this hero that we all love? What underwrites the Spider-Verse films, which are the best example of this, right? What underwrites the Spider-Man films or the Spider-Verse films is that Spider-Man works because of who he is inside. It's not his costume, it's not his gadgets, it's not his powers, it's his heart. You can ask where that idea comes from. That idea comes from Steve Ditko, right? Like, full stop. That is his contribution, and he gives us that contribution independent of Stan Lee, right? And he gives us that contribution, and we know so because he and Stan aren't even talking. And that's not just Ditko saying that, that's Stan saying that at the time when that story comes out, right? So you know, we have to do these things. I think we have a responsibility to it. If this is a cultural artifact that matters to us, we must investigate it, we must interrogate it, we must figure out how this explains us.
If you go back and look, those 3 months that they had the Master Planner story, look across the Marvel line. That was Marvel's greatest month ever.
Oh, yeah?
I mean, if you look back at the same 3 months, they introduced the Inhumans in Fantastic Four. They introduced the Sentinels in the X-Men, all in the same 3 months.
Oh, wow.
It was like that summer. It was 3 summer issues of Marvel, of whatever year that was. That was their greatest summer. They were like, if you ever want to start collecting comics, buy all the Marvel comics from those 3 months, and that will make you a fan, because they were terrific.
People will say, you know, he was an artist, you know, and Stan will say, or other, you know, he was the artist behind this. No, and he wasn't even just an illustrator; he was a creator. I mean, he really was a creator. You know, in those, you know, later Spider-Man issues, it's clear, you know, when when it was known that Stan wasn't even talking to him, he was plotting all of that stuff. He was coming up with the whole storylines. He was, you know, mapping all that out. But that's who he was.
When Steve Ditko left the Amazing Spider-Man title and Marvel after issue number 38, a rumor swirled around fans that chief among his reasons for leaving was due to a falling out with Stan Lee over the true identity of the Green Goblin. According to the myth, Steve Ditko wanted the Green Goblin, whose identity up to issue 39 of The Amazing Spider-Man had never been revealed, to be a completely unknown person, as this would be more realistic. But Stan Lee opted for it to be revealed that Norman Osborn, father of Peter's friend from college, Harry, was, in fact, the Green Goblin, in order to create more drama. This myth lacks any credence due to the fact that both Stan Lee and Steve Ditko have admitted that they were not on speaking terms by this point in time. Amazing Spider-Man's number 33's iconic lifting scene serves as a great example of how Ditko was contributing the majority of the storytelling to Spider-Man, with the dialogue provided by Lee secondarily. Furthermore, as already evidenced, Steve Ditko planned his stories ahead and laid the groundwork for future story points in prior issues. As far back as Amazing Spider-Man number 27, Ditko had begun visually designing Norman Osborn before he was named. Distinct among his features was the unique Osborn hairline that Ditko created and gave to both Norman and Harry. The Osborn hair is a feature that warrants attention, as it is once more a prime example of Ditko visually laying out plot points and inviting the reader to look closer and examining the details in every story. By visually connecting Norman and Harry so early on, Ditko was also building towards a big dramatic reveal. Dr. Zack Kruse further explores this in his text, Mysterious Travelers.
I cannot take credit for that. That is Steve. Steve said it. He puts it in his essays when he's writing a history of his time at Marvel, a series that was cut short. So he's crystal clear about that. And So yeah, I wouldn't take any kind of credit for that at all. That's just pulling out what he said and then putting it into practice and demonstrating, like, he's not making this stuff up. This is not like a false memory after the fact. So no, that's something I got straight from him. But what that taught me, though, is that as I read that from him in that essay, I mean, and I already suspected, I had long suspected the Doctor Strange thing, well before
Mhm.
I'd written. And in fact, that was like the first letter I wrote him, because I was
Okay.
just like, I have to know, right?
Mhm.
So anyway, but what that demonstrated to me between the Doctor Strange thing and then him writing about Norman Osborn in that way is that if he's doing this at this sort of granular level on this series, right, then it stands to reason that he's doing it in other places too. So let's take that hypothesis and put it to the test. Can we observe this anywhere else in his sort of visual oeuvre? And as it turns out, you can, right? And I do that sort of mini case study on the, from his time at Charlton, because they had just sort of Carl Memling's writing the same story over and over, giving it to different artists with just little tweaks. How does this artist draw it? How does Ditko draw it? How does this guy draw it? How does Ditko draw it? And then and if we see something distinct in them, what is distinct in Ditko's? And is that a pattern that we can pull out in other works as well? And as it turns out, yes, you can, right?
Yeah.
So that was sort of like the impetus, right? That was the catalyst for like, oh my God, he must be doing this everywhere.
Mhm.
And as it turns out, like, and then there's other things we can sort of hypothesize about, and I hypothesize about in the book. One is, about the Ted Cord stories.
Yep.
Those seem to be unused Spider-Man scripts. He did not want to answer that question. It was in the same letter as the Doctor Strange email, or Doctor Strange letter. He didn't say no, but he just didn't want to answer the question. But just to be clear, like, he never directly answered that question.
Yeah.
So there's that, but there's also little things too, like characters who don't really have time to get developed, but are definitely there, right? Like, whether it's Mary Jane or Robbie Robertson, or, there's, and I don't really talk about it in the book, but there's this one Black Doctor that appears in both Spider-Man and Doctor Strange. It's the same doctor who takes care of Aunt May, who takes care of Stephen Strange when Strange is, on the outs in New York. Like, he's very clearly planting seeds for these other characters to come back later, because that's what he does. He's always thinking sort of long form, and what can I set up to sort of knock down later. So he's not thinking. I think that's the thing that makes him, one of the things that makes him distinct from a lot of his peers, because a lot of his peers working in the same time, save for maybe Eisner or Jack Kirby, right? Like, they're not thinking long form. Right? Like, no, they're thinking Superman's going to punch this dinosaur in this issue, and then the next one, his head's going to be a lion's head. And then the one after that, something's going to be tragic with Lois that he has to sort of fix. And then they're just moving on. In this issue, the Flash is fighting Gorilla Grodd, because Grodd's going to become the mayor of Central City. And the next one, it's Captain Cold. And they're just thinking, very short form, let's get through these particular issues. And he's not thinking that way at all. He's trying to sort of string together a series of complex ideas that will eventually reveal themselves to the reader. And he's counting on us, right, wrong, or indifferent, he's counting on us as the readers to be able to pick up what he's laying down. He has high expectations for us as readers. And I suspect, and this is just off the top of my head, but I suspect that that's also part of his frustration with a lot of fans, is that they're not paying attention. He's like, no, you fools, I've laid it all out for you. Why did you believe this cock and bull story about Norman Osborn? Did you not read what I put on the page? Are you sure you're a fan? Are you sure you're a reader of mine? Right? So, those things just kind of, it makes sense that they would eat at him when he's clearly working so hard to sort of lay all of this groundwork.
So he wrote 16 essays. Okay, so the essays start out when he left Marvel, whatever it was, 67, 66, 67, whatever he left Marvel, he took notes, personal notes of what actually occurred through the development of Spider-Man and these comics. So he had these notes. There was a chain of events in the 90s where a couple things really triggered him. And one of them was was a comic book journal where Stan said he created that lifting scene, and that all he did was give Steve the idea, and he took it and ran with it. So there were a few triggers like that where my uncle, and there was a correspondent of his, Russ Maharis, and Russ he was a PR guy, military guy, and he had a long correspondence with my uncle, and he would always stick up for him, and he'd say, I know you don't want me to stick up for you, but I am anyway. So like, I am. And he said, my uncle wrote him back and said, you know, I can't stop you, more power to you. So, but Russ kept writing to him saying, look, you need to say your side. You need to say your side. So in 99, 2000, 2001 time frame, he wrote 16 essays from his notes on what occurred with Amazing Fantasy 15, Spider-Man 1, and the dialogue and exchange and information of what happened through the developmental phase of Spider-Man. And it is so revealing. You will read those, and it will become very clear who was in charge, and really probably why Stan stopped talking to him. Because Stan, in these essays, Stan is clearly giving him ideas. In issue 2, Stan wanted to introduce Spider-Woman or Spider-Girl. And Mike was like, who is that? Like, are they friends? Do they go to the same school? Is this now a Batman and Robin team up moving into the future? And of course, Stan can't answer any of these questions because Stan doesn't think that way. He wants sales, you know? So my uncle just didn't do it. Yeah. He said at one point he needed to make J. Jonah Jameson nicer to Peter Parker. So my uncle writes his thoughts on that. And he said the next issue, I made him even meaner to Peter Parker. So there was these dialogues going on, and you could see through these essays that you're reading that why Stan eventually said, oh, Steve Ditko thinks he's a genius of the world, you know? Well, at that point, he was creating something amazing, but he was really rejecting a lot of things that Stan was saying. But it's all written in these essays, about 40 pages of essays about that era. Now, this is not from me saying this because I heard it because it was, take your nephew to work day or something. It was, this is his words, him who was there at the time. And my uncle is not known for embellishing things and lying and whatever. He had an integrity. He was saying what he knew.
Although Steve Ditko never associated himself with any movie adaptations of his work with Marvel, he was a lifelong movie fan and harbored aspirations to see his own creator-owned stories adapted for the screen.
Well, one of the things that is driving us is in the early 2000s, he and I were writing back and forth, and I have a friend, David Kitchens, who runs a post-production studio here in Los Angeles, and has worked with James Cameron and Steven Spielberg, all these guys, and has won Academy Awards and Emmys and everything. So I was writing my uncle, and I said, Uncle Steve, I have this connection with someone who knows real producers, and what would you be interested in doing? Would you want me to leverage this in some way? So he said yes. He said what, and then he wrote to me about what he wanted. He said he wanted Static to be a movie, big screen. He wanted a couple things, like he wanted a character that he had created, Missing Man, to be an animated cartoon. So he was talking about his characters and what he wanted to do. So he said for and he started to send me, comics saying, here, show them this, because really, what's a comic? It's a storyboard, for a movie or a show. So anyway, we were going back and forth for quite a while on things that he wanted to do and how we wanted to take his characters up to the next level. I have my own business. I'm buried. I dropped the ball. I, just never did the amount of follow through that I needed to. But I need to pick that back up. I mean, I have the regret of not having followed through while he was alive and getting these things done that he wanted to pursue. So here I am, in a position to be able to, push some of that forward. So ultimately, we're looking at some bigger things moving into more of a mainstream media. But prior to that, we are going to be compiling some things. We're going to do his collected essays. Yes, all his artwork speaks volumes, but his essays are volumes, with words that say exactly what was on his mind, So, and some of them are hard to come by.
This documentary, like any work that examines the art and stories of Steve Ditko, is paradoxical, as Ditko never appreciated his work being interpreted through an intermediary and preferred for the story to be related directly to the reader. So, how can such work be reconciled? Dr. Kruse provides insight on how he weighed this consideration in writing Mysterious Travelers.
It did weigh on me. It still kind of weighs on me in certain ways, because I know he would hate it. But I mean, and not that I don't think he would hate the ideas, because I think that they are a fair sort of conversation point with his work. So I don't think he would hate what I wrote. I just think he would hate the idea that it was written, because again, it's an outsider who is, acting as an intermediary, not on his behalf, but I think that he would not be out of line in sort of interpreting it that way, right? So that's there's certainly a level of, it's not a violation, but it's certainly something that I'm aware he wouldn't, he would not be, thrilled about. On the other hand, I feel that work like this, whether it's mine or somebody else's or whatever, I mean, just as academics, I mean, what we do, if we do our jobs right and we really know what we're talking about, we are adding to the conversation, and we are sort of, I wouldn't say guiding the conversation, but we are providing context that folks might not otherwise get, or might not have the time or the resources or the experience to have immediate access to. So, and I think that that's important that we do those things, all of us at any level, whether it's as teachers or as writers or both. So, and then in addition to that, one of the things, and I've said this to a couple of the Ditko family members as I've gotten to know them over the past few years, and they're people that I really respect and like, and they're salt of the earth people. I mean, I think like Steve, they're salt of the earth. But one of the things I said to a couple of them, I was like, and they agree, like, but they also feel very similar, like, but that time has passed, we have to move forward. And in the case that I make to them, I was like, yeah, and we also have to remember that there are great artists and great texts that we only have because someone defied the wishes of the artist. And I'm not saying that that's entirely a defensible, like the most defensible position, but there's no Emily Dickinson if somebody doesn't pull all those poems out of a drawer, right? Yeah. How much Kafka did we lose, right? Or did we gain back, right? And on and on and on. And that doesn't mean that those projects aren't often fraught or they're not questionable or but the alternative is to not have them at all. And I think that for someone like Ditko, who is committed to the idea that the work speaks for itself, as things come forward, whether it's me working on my projects or the family working on their projects, or Jack Harris's book or whatever the case may be, what all of those things do, even though Steve probably would have hated them, what they all do is they give us a clearer picture of this guy that gave us something, right? And without trying to be maudlin or to overstate it, everyone listening to this show is probably listening to this show because of Spider-Man at some level. There's not a single person tuning into this that doesn't know who Spider-Man is. And outside of the reach of this program or any podcast or any comic book store, there are few corners of this globe where Spider-Man is not a recognized, idea.
Yeah.
And because that is true. And we know that's true. Because that is true, we have, academics and people who are invested in this I think have a responsibility to figure out what it means to know who Spider-Man is. And if we want to understand what Spider-Man is and why this character speaks to us, well, as it turns out, we have to understand who this guy is. And what he tells us is something so interesting.
On the 29th of June, 2018, Steve Ditko was found unresponsive in his apartment. Police said that he had passed away within the previous 2 days. Pronounced dead at the age of 90, legions of fans from around the world mourned the loss of one of the greatest creators within the medium of comic books.
He was in his 90s, and we had seen, looked like anybody through their 80s, heading into their early 90s. His eyesight was failing a little bit. His hearing was, not what it used to be. His health had been degrading. He was in and out of the hospital. But that year, in 2018, my dad and my mom and the family were very aware that he had gone into the hospital earlier in the year. I don't know if he had fallen or what had happened, but something put him in the hospital. And then in May, they had some contact. I know my dad had called him, and he had gone in the hospital again in May. Everybody was aware of what was going on. The family was anyway. Yeah. I mean, my dad had been talking to him. So, it was, that he had passed away. It was actually in his apartment complex. It was in his apartment at one night. So, and because he lived alone, look, I mean, that's the nature of, no one realizes for a while because, you're not having necessarily daily contact. Sometimes he probably would go into the studio, and maybe, weekends he didn't, go into the studio. So I don't know if there wasn't anybody, although he did have I think there was some, I forget what they call it, someone who just kind of checks in on you after you're sort of rehabbing from, having a hospital stay. Yeah. So I think that's what happened is he was supposed to call in, or there was supposed to be some connection with a healthcare worker or something. And then they kind of did a wellness check or something. And I think they hadn't heard from him for a day or so. And at that point, I think my dad was trying to get a hold of him. So I think it was just right at the end when he passed away. It was just, it was just circumstance and situation. He happened to be in his apartment alone, and he passed away. And it took a day or so for someone to be able to get a hold of him and call the police and actually get into the studio, into his apartment to find out what had happened. So I don't know that wasn't anything unusual from anybody who just lived alone. People were aware of his health declining, and he was aware of it. He was in and out of the hospital, that year a couple times.
For all of the myths shared about Steve Ditko, too little has been expressed for his passion for the medium of comics. Sadly, no longer with us, his work will last for generations to come. A firm believer in that the work should speak for itself, this belief served as a two-edged sword in that so many myths sprung up around him. But it has also drawn so many readers in closer to examine his stories and realize the limitless potential for the medium of comic books. Today, the Ditko family continues to share the life and legacy of Steve and his work, with new projects dedicated to the conservation and study of his art and writing.
He was in the military. He kept photo albums. He had a photo record of his whole military career, and he had photos on this side and a description of what it was on this side. And so there's we have hundreds of photos of him. So we have a lot of things that we want to put out in this book to kind of illustrate who he was as a person. So that's something I think our mission is not just to get his content out there for a new generation, but to say what he had done, but to kind of take a step back and say who he was, and make things more accessible, like his essays and things like that. So the Friends and Family book, I think, is probably more illustrative of our bigger mission as to just get his name out there and who he was actually as a person. Secondarily to that, we want to get his things that he had done in the past more accessible and more available. And then we'll take things kind of to the next level. Look, what he did with Spider-Man in 2 or 3 years has rippled down for decades. So, there's an opportunity there for some of his characters to be able to do a similar thing. So we'll be working on that. But I'll tell you, I would leave with one parting thought, is in the early photos in the 60s, he had that word think, on his light. And I think I'll just, from my perspective, that was his mindset at the time. Clearly, I mean, somebody has that on your thing. What's it telling you? It's like he's telling himself, like, think about what's going on, like really deeply process it. He was that kind of guy. But when we went into his studio after he had passed away, he had another saying on an index card on his desk. And it wasn't think. It was never give up.
Wow.
So to me, as a parting thought and as a direction from himself, is pursue what you believe is, that is in your heart. Pursue the things that you really want to see, to express yourself, and don't let somebody else, there's this one saying that, I mean, I have all these quotes that I've been collecting, and I have a document that's 50, 60 pages from excerpts from letters and essays called Steve Ditko Speaks. And what I'm trying to do, again, is just, I'll probably collect at some point all the times he gave people artistic advice, or all the times he gave whatever encouragement. But this one here, to me, again, it's to kind of cap this off. He said, "The wants and wishes of others are no reliable guide to one's life and well-being." Yeah. Doesn't matter what anybody else thinks. It really, really, really doesn't. In terms of you going for your goals, your ambitions, and the things that you want to hold true to yourself. What other people think or say about it, you need to take that with a grain of salt. You need to follow what's true for you, and never give up.
A hero measures a man at his best in the worst situation. A hero is a man admired for his qualities or achievements and regarded as an ideal or model.